Good evening. So this is the first of 3 video commentaries that I will be doing on the concepts that we've been reading about, namely the uncanny, the grotesque, and abjection, as conceptualized respectively by Sigmund Freud, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Julia Kristeva. And to start off with, we'll be talking about Freud's The Uncanny. Okay, so I put together this PowerPoint presentation, which I will make available to you also separately for you to refer back to in the course materials on Blackboard, as well as in the current weekly folder. So this PowerPoint covers all 3 concepts, but in each video, I will be talking about each one individually, starting off with, as I said, the uncanny. All right, so for each of these thinkers, I want to try to give you just some very brief biographical information so you have some context of who they are and where they're coming from. So hopefully you've at least heard of Sigmund Freud, who was born in Freiburg, Moravia, when he in what was then the Austrian Empire, as today the Czech Republic, on May 6, 1856, and he died in September 23rd, 1939. So this would place him kind of smack dab in the middle of modernist thought, which is kind of the intellectual, artistic, philosophical movements that kind of surround especially World War I, on either side of World War I, and then kind of leading up to World War II. But the thinking of Freud's ideas were kind of, in a lot of ways, one of the bases for modernist thought more broadly, going into the arts and even film and music and stuff like that, as well as painting and literature and all this. But Freud is most closely associated with Vienna, where he moved with his family when he was just a little boy, and where he would stay until the Nazi annexation of Austria 78 years later. So, as you can see, he spent the bulk of his life there, the vast majority of his life in Vienna. And he is considered the father of psychoanalysis. He was a physiologist, a medical doctor, a psychologist, author, and as I said, one of the most influential thinkers of the early 20th century. One of the real pillars of modernist thought. And we still talk about Freud today, obviously. A lot of his, there's been some pushback, to say the least, against a lot of his ideas. But a lot of his concepts are also still employed today. In psychology, psychiatry, the whole field. So he's really important. And one of the things for which he is most important is that he developed a theoretical tripartite model of the mind or personality. And this model consisted of the id, ego, and superego. So I'm hoping that you've at least heard of these terms. Perhaps some of you might have a really solid understanding of what these terms are. We're by no means here going to do a complete breakdown of Freud's body of work, but I just want to kind of point you to his main ideas that are still part of modern thinking in a lot of ways in certain schools and even in everyday speech. We hear about people on an ego trip or what have you, right? So this is part of our, these words are in common usage. So for Freud, the id is that part of the mind in which are situated the instinctual sexual drives which require satisfaction. So this is essentially, the id essentially correlates to the subconscious. The id is entirely in the subconscious. That's these kind of primal urges that are the motivating factor the unseen motivating factor for a lot of our actions and behaviors, according to Freud. The superego and the ego are also both, they have some unconscious elements as well, but the id is entirely subconscious. The superego is that part of the mind which contains the conscience, namely socially acquired control mechanisms which have been internalized and which are usually imparted in the first instance by the parents. And then eventually you could talk about how religion plays into the dictates of the superego, and taboos as decided by society, as conventionalized by society, things like that. These are the sort of laws of the mind which tamper down those primal urges of the id that are trying to rise up from the subconscious, those kind of animalistic urges. The superego is kind of the social constraints, as it were, that become ingrained in our minds and control the id. And then the ego is the conscious self that is created by the dynamic tensions and interactions between the id and the superego, and has the task of reconciling their conflicting demands with the requirements of external reality. So this is essentially the personality, right? This is what comes out on the surface of our personality. This is what, this is what we present to each other in the world, the ego. This is what's on top. It's the top of the iceberg, as it were, that's sticking out of the water. Whereas the id is that whole hidden part of the iceberg. And then the superego is what kind of binds them. And the ego results from that tension between the id and the superego, those sort of social forces in competition with those inner primal animalistic urges. So again, this is a very simplified rundown of these ideas. This isn't the place to go into an in-depth analysis of all of Freud's thought. I'm just trying to map it out for you, just give you the coordinates for where we're coming from with this, or where he's coming from, and then we'll talk specifically about the uncanny here in a second. So one of the other tenets of his philosophy, basically, is that the healthy mental development progresses through a series of specific psychosexual stages. Again, this is something that I would imagine a lot of you have at least heard of, even if you can't fully say what each one means, right? So the stages are oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. So again, to Freud's thinking, the healthy adult has gone through these different stages and has progressed to the genital stage of psychosexuality, and that's where the focus is. So some other key concepts that go along with these are repression, pushing conflicts back into the unconscious, right? And this is the one that has a lot to do with, they all have something to do with the uncanny, but especially repression, right? Because again, it's the recurrence of the repressed. But on the flip side of that is sublimation, which is it's a channeling of the sexual drives into the achievement of socially acceptable goals in art, science, poetry, and so forth. So this is sort of a transformation of those primal animalistic urges of the id. It's a kind of a metamorphosis of those into these higher pursuits, art, science, poetry, and so forth. Fixation, the failure to progress beyond one of the developmental stages. So I imagine a lot of you have heard of anal retentive, or somebody has an oral fixation. To Freud's way of thinking, it means that person didn't adequately progress beyond that particular psychosexual stage. So if somebody is anal retentive, if they're fixated on that part of their development, it influences their personality in certain ways. And then regression, which is a return to the behavior characteristic of one of the stages. Right, so this is related to This is very closely related to fixation. So, is somebody with an oral fixation, um, Freud might say that that's the reason for smoking cigarettes or overeating. That a person might use that as a coping mechanism because they're stuck in that sort of psychosexual mental stage. And if somebody has an anal fixation, um, we talk about them as being really tidy or fussy about certain things. Uh, really liking order and all of that. Our use of these terms is really rooted in Freud's ideas of fixation and regression. So I'm sure you've all heard somebody called anal retentive or something like that. That's where that comes from. All right, so that's it for the basic biographical rundown of Freud. Again, very simplified, very broad. This isn't the place to go into all of his deep thinking, if for no other reason than just for the sake of time. It's a vast body of work and an incredibly complex body of work. So this isn't the place to go into it all. Instead, we are focused on the uncanny. So in German, unheimlich means uncanny, right? And its opposite is heimlich. But Freud kind of traces the etymology. The etymology is kind of the history of a word, etymology. He traces the etymology of unheimlich and its opposite, heimlich, through different languages. This is all in the first part of his essay on the uncanny, which you didn't necessarily have to read, but I hope a lot of you did anyway. And if you did, you'll remember that he goes through different definitions of these words and translations into different languages. And he acknowledges that on their most basic level, Heimlich means kind of homely, of the home. And Unheimlich means unhomely, right? It's the opposite, not of the home. But through his tracing of the etymology, he finds these kind of more complex definitions, these more subdued understandings of the words throughout different languages and through time. So what he concludes through this long etymology is that the meaning of Heimlich and Unheimlich kind of overlap. They're not exactly polar opposites. They sort of intersect and meet in the middle. And what he derives from this is that Unheimlich, meaning it can mean something that's meant to be, in addition to being not of the house, unhomely, it can also mean something that's meant to be kept hidden and unseen, right? It means it comes to mean of the house and not of the house at the same time, right? So what that brings us to is this idea of the familiar contained within the unfamiliar. So if unheimlich equates with the uncanny, and unheimlich kind of means in the house but not of the house, or of the house but not of the house at the same time, we can sort of say that it means a feeling when we're confronted with the familiar contained within the unfamiliar. Right? It's the return of the repressed, something that was meant to kept hidden. If our mind is analogous to the house, right? Then something that we've kept repressed in ourselves, it's familiar to us, right? We've experienced it, but we've repressed it. And when that emerges in some unexpected way, and even a threatening way, then we're forced to confront this thing that we've tried to repress, this thing that we've tried to keep hidden. It's forced its way to the surface somehow, and it's forced a confrontation with our conscious minds. And this is from this that the uncanny arises. It's an emergence of the hidden self. So when we see something of ourself presented in a threatening way, or or an unreal way, it kind of underscores that thing that we tried to keep repressed, whatever it is, that thing from childhood, right? It might be, especially the fears of childhood, right? And when we're faced with something that embodies those fears of childhood that we've repressed and that we've surmounted through our different modes of rationalization, moving into adulthood and so on, when we're confronted with something in the flesh, as it were, that brings that thing which we feared somehow to life, there's this sort of mental breakdown in which we doubt our rationalization. We doubt that the explanations, the things we've used to explain away these things we feared as children, we come to doubt that those things are valid, and that in fact these things that we feared are actually real in some way, right? So it's that thing that we've tried to hide away, that we've tried to keep unseen. When we see that thing which we've tried to keep hidden, then that's when we get the sense of the uncanny. And this manifests itself often in repetition and doubles. Maybe you've heard the term doppelganger, which is used frequently in films and even like comic books and stories and all kinds of things. A doppelganger is just a person's double, but it's not the same as like a twin. A doppelganger is when somebody has like a double of themselves somewhere else, that has a double somewhere else out in the world. Somebody that looks exactly like them, and they're eerily familiar. Which it's really important, as we'll get to in 1 second, in a couple moments, that it has to be eerie. It can't just be familiar, right? If you see your neighbor every day, there's nothing uncanny about that. And like this idea of repetition of doubles, like when I finish this video, I'm going to watch it again and I'll edit it down. And when I see my face on the screen, I won't get a particularly uncanny feeling from that. It's expected. It's not confronting me. And part of that is because it's not forcing itself out of something. It's not forcing itself out of some restraints of repression. I understand what it is when I see my face on the screen. I understand what I'm looking at, and it's not something that I've tried to hide away, right? So it's not something that's re-emerging after a period of repression. It's something that I'm aware of, that I remember clearly, and that I'm not trying to hide. I'm not trying to bury this somewhere in my subconscious. It's something that I want to see as part of my work, and so on and so forth. So the point of that is, just because something is double doesn't necessarily make it uncanny. You probably wouldn't, if you have a twin that you grew up with, say, you probably wouldn't say that you get an uncanny feeling every time you look at your twin. It's not something that has reoccurred after a period of being hidden away. It's not something that's forcing itself at you. And it's something. It's also not eerie, right? It's something that you're used to. It becomes the everyday, right? And even if you like just looking at a normal photograph of yourself, say, you probably don't get a particularly uncanny feeling when that happens. When you see yourself in a photo, which we very frequently do nowadays, right? We really live in a society these days of repetition, of technological reproduction. So we're used to seeing our own faces. We're used to seeing familiar images. We're used to seeing sort of manifestations of our personality in the world around us through things like social media and all of this. And we can talk about how accurate those representations of our personality are and so on and so forth, but that's really kind of a different issue besides the point I'm trying to make here. And there's nothing particularly threatening about that. I've used this term, a critical reflection of the self. It's something that makes us question. I don't mean critical in the way of, oh, I look at myself in the mirror And I think I need to. My reflection tells me that I need to lose a few pounds or whatever. I don't mean like that. I mean a deeper kind of criticism, something that makes us question the structures of our mind, of our personality, right? Something that um, criticizes the foundations of our perceptions of the world, of what we think is real, and what we think is real within ourselves. Or even that presents us with a sense of guilt, perhaps, right? We see a lot of times in ghost stories, especially, a ghost might come about uh, and haunt somebody that did a crime to them, right? That's something that the person that committed that act of violence and killed the person or whatever, and you might say that that represents a kind of repression, that person is trying to repress their guilt, but the when the person that they killed reemerges as a ghost, it forces them to confront their guilt that from that crime that they did. Um, but it could also be critical in the sense of, like, I've included Sophia here. If you watch that link I sent you, then you know who she is now. This sort of very realistic robot, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not she has actual intelligence or whatever. But the point is, we might experience the uncanny when we look at Sophia, at this very humanistic machine, when we see something human in her, and this mechanized device, if you will. Uh, when we see ourselves reflected in this machine, then it's critical in that it might make us question what it means to be human. So we see ourselves, but somehow altered, so that it makes us question what we mean when we say ourselves, when we talk about, the I. What am I? What are you? And when you see these sort of doubles that make us question that, that's when it's uncanny, right? So normally, if you look at like your twin, you probably don't get a feeling every time you look at your twin of um, questioning what you are and questioning the structures of, the foundations of your personality, of your mind, of your sanity, right? So there has to really be something of, the uncanny is connected to fear, right? So there has to be something sort of threatening in it. It can't just be, to call something properly uncanny, it can't just be a double or a repetition. There has to be something unnatural about it, or supernatural, maybe even magical, darkly magical, however you want to say that. So for this hand here, right? I used it because I liked the image, and Freud talks a bit about severed limbs, and maybe it's a bit eerie and uncanny, but it's also part of. This is from the Addams Family, which, if you know what the Addams Family is, it's a comedy. So this is a silly little monster. So if you're watching the movie, or reading cartoons, and you see this severed hand, you might initially get a sense of uncanny from it, but that would quickly fade because the movie is ultimately meant to make you laugh. Um, it's a family of ghouls and monsters and sort of gothic oddities, as it were. So for Freud, he talks about how the importance of genre and the separation between subject matter and kind of the emotional focus of the presentation of the subject that's being presented, right? So it's a question of artistic representation and contextual importance of the uncanny. So this is if you've ever watched the movie The Others, this is the little girl from that, and this is, of course, Casper the Friendly Ghost. So they're both ghosts, but one should give us, through one, we should get a feeling of uncanniness, while the other most likely not. And the reason for this is because if you've seen The Others, Nicole Kidman is she's basically seeing ghosts of her family, right? So we're meant to empathize with her. We're meant to sort of go on this breakdown of her sanity with her, which is arising through seeing ghosts of her children, right? And these things are they're rising up from her past. They represent repression, right? And they're confronting her, and they're making her question what is real and what is not, and who she is, and the framework of her mind. They're forcing her to question that. Whereas Casper is just a silly little cartoon, right? He's cute. There's nothing threatening about him. In fact, it's in his name. He's the friendly ghost, and he's not necessarily even though he's a ghost, he's a spirit or whatever. He's not meant to force us into a confrontation with uh, the repressed components of our personality. He's just meant to make us laugh a little bit. And like in the movie, there's maybe some sad parts or whatever. The old movie from the '90s, but it doesn't place the main character with whom we're supposed to empathize into a position where they're being confronted with something that they've tried to hide away. Once you meet Casper, you don't want to keep him. He doesn't represent something that any of the characters are trying to keep hidden from society or from themselves. More importantly, he's just trying to make a friend ultimately. Whereas the ghosts and something like the other are making the character with whom we're supposed to empathize. They're making her confront something from her past that she's tried to keep hidden from herself, right? So, and then that results in the breakdown of her character. So genre, context, and the way it's represented are crucial for the uncanny. It can't just be a double or a double. Just because something is repeated doesn't mean that it is uncanny per se. It has to carry all of this with it too, right? It has to carry with it at least some symbolic value representing something that we've tried to keep hidden away from ourselves, or somehow make us question that thing which we recognize in this other entity. That has to make us question how that thing defines us as humans, or as egos, if you will. It has to make us question the constructs of our ego, and how we got there, and what parts of those constructs are valid and which are not, and in most cases this will somehow be connected to a childhood fear. So Freud, of course, is he's always talking about castration and all this. So for him, in the story that he talks about, the Hoffman story with the Sandman, and the Sandman coming around and taking the kid's eyes from childhood, to Freud, that all represents castration. In some way, it's symbolic of this childhood fear of castration, and that's reemerging as a reality and something threatening the character of that story. So, directly or indirectly, it somehow has to represent a fear of childhood, and make us question if that fear which we've repressed as something, as a fiction, if perhaps that thing which we feared is actually real, and that which we feared might actually be inflicted on us. Okay, so that's it for part one of this three-part commentary. Stay tuned for part two, which you will find in the same place as you find this one, in the weekly folder and in the course materials.